this is actually such a perfect lead-in to power, complexity, and decisions.
Wow, it's a great segue. Thank you for.
I mean, how does one have power or not have power? Why are sometimes we afraid to exercise power? And I think these are some really interesting questions within the nonprofit world, the church world, that we need to talk about. And the opposing is sometimes people exercise power in the wrong ways. This is also a follow-on to our previous work on culture, that because power and complexity is a part of culture. So I have a number of things I will send out to you after this presentation, and it will include the slides we're going to go through as we talk about this question of power. So, and sort of wrapped around power in this question of complexity is also the question of decisions, and how we as organizations and how we individually make decisions, which are an exercise of power in one sense. So as you remember, this is our chart, and today we're going to be talking here over on the visionary organizational leadership side, thinking about things like change and operational effectiveness and strategy, and how that all fits together in the mission of an organization. So here's a quote on culture. This is from one of our previous presenters, but think about this again in the context of Pastor Chapman's talk last week, that when we think about culture, I mean, there's all kinds of pieces to it, language and music and art and values, things that for an institution are key to it. And I really like in his definition that it's both real and it's what people perceive as a component of your culture. And as you can imagine, tons of people have done research on this. And one of those groups that have done this is a group headed by, can you all see this website that I just flipped up?
Yep.
Okay, it's called GLOBE, the Global Leadership and Organizational Behavioral Effectiveness Study. This thing has been going on for decades now and has tens of thousands of research results in looking at culture across all kinds of different continents and ethnicities. And so I will send you at the end of this a bibliography for this on decision making and culture, so you can go to this website and take a look at it. But back in the beginning, House started this research, and as they got like 5 or 6 years into it, they kind of defined these 9 dimensions of culture. So again, remembering there are values, there's art, there's language that all fits into this question of culture. But these 9 dimensions help them understand this question of organizational behavior and relationships and power and culture inside organizations. So I encourage you to go take a look at this. Believe it or not, my time in the military, the military is not known for being overly sensitive sometimes, to say the least. But as we would go interact with other cultures, we went through specific training to understand what and how to speak to people, how to act, how to physically interact with them. Whether it was a country like Pakistan, where we lived 2 years, or Japan, where we lived for a couple of years, or Korea, we actually went through that type of training to help understand in minimal. Some of the assignments required intensive language training, but we also did get some of the times minimal language training if there was not a big, like, for example, Pakistan, English was one of 2, Urdu was the other national languages. But it's all framed in this question of culture. And I find this fascinating when we look at, when we try and speak to each other even, language frames how we interact. And And sometimes some things are not translatable back and forth. And it takes a lot of listening and humility to be able to interact across cultures. And I think that was something that Pastor Chapman really brought out in his presentation. How, and I happen to grow up in a Lutheran church, so I get it about the organ, but the organ is a cultural overlay on Lutheran worship, right? I mean, that's what it is. And so this culture question becomes really important. And all of us, whether it in a church, in a synod, or a district, or a social services agency, or a higher education institution, live in a complex environment. It's complex because we work with people, right? I mean, if it wasn't, if we worked only with artificial intelligence and computers, it might be one way, but they are complex environments. And so, I don't know if you've ever read anything by Dan Ellender, but I really like his material. And complexity is a huge reality of leadership. I mean, crisis, betrayal, loneliness, weariness, glory, all those things are important. But complexity underlies everything we do. And how we work through that, how we understand that's a little bit important. So, you all know I'm a science guy, and I'm sort of a math nut. So there's a whole area of mathematics behind complexity. And you see this practically every day when you get a weather report, because those predictions and analysis of the weather are brought to you by very complex weather models that, in one sense, can help you understand things, but in another sense, are sort of full of baloney the further out they get. So a complex system mathematically looks like this in the sense of it's a very steady state thing. And this is a relatively simple computer model where it's in math language called deterministic. You can calculate the outcome every time. What happens though in this system is you change one variable in this system 0.1%, and that happens. And my point within complex systems that we live and work in, sometimes you can go along day to day and it's just like this. Things hum along and life is good, and but you poke it, which you think is a trivial thing, and that happens. So that is not that you should be afraid of change, but you need to understand that the possible outcomes are not always predictable. And most often are probably 80% of the time not predictable. And you need to be prepared for unintended consequences and outcomes inside our organizations. Here's the characteristics of a complex system. You can see them here. And if our organizations don't self-organize hierarchically, I've never seen one that doesn't. You know, whether it's a social service agency or a church or a higher education institution, there's these lot of components, committees and councils and people and pastors and presidents and all those types of things that organize this way and actually can stay fairly stable. But again, a seemingly small change can produce unintended consequences. And what Ellender's getting at in his work on leadership is really understanding that we work in complex systems that are a function of people and culture and have their own history, have their own ways they interact. And as we move into these, we need to be aware of them. And when you walk, especially if you walk into a new organization, it's just really good in the beginning to listen to try and figure out who's on first. And we're going to talk more about organizational culture here in a few minutes. So this is not to scare anybody, but it's to understand that sometimes very small changes can produce unintended consequences. And by the way, even though you can discretely calculate each one of these types of systems statistically look like random results, which is a big deal. Okay, so into that, now we throw in this mix of culture and people and interactions complexity, we throw this question of power. So tell me, and you'll have to unmute a little bit, what is power? Easy question, huh? Everybody doesn't have to answer at once. It's okay. Think about it. What? How do you understand power? What is it?
Ian looks like he has something very powerful to say.
It's when you get the pizza out of the fridge, right?
That was power, Ian.
Wow, getting called out over the
With all respect, Ian, I just
So I guess the first word that comes to mind, which isn't necessarily positive, but control, or some form of control.
Yeah. Okay. Good one. Where do you see? How do you see it in your organization? I mean, you say, man, there's power. So some form of control. I like that, Ian.
I think there's power in influence.
Mark, incredible, right? So that, if I can I add a little bit onto that?
Hey, absolutely. It's your webinar. Yep.
But you're right. This whole question of influence, and that is independent of hierarchy, right, Mark?
Yes.
And I'm sure as a pastor of a congregation, one of the first things you learn when you get there is, where are the power centers?
Right.
It's important to understand that.
How do you do it? You have to touch something.
Any other ideas?
I might. What's that?
Go.
I was going to say Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch talks about those who get to make sense of the world have power. So those who have agency to make sense of things and sort of impose that, he would define that as power.
Yeah. Andrew, that's amazing, because we see that every day on the television, right? And people attempting to frame what happens in the world to make it look like their outcome. Otherwise, a common term now is fake news, but everybody frames things and tries to make sense of them. Great, all huge points in this question of power. So here's my second question, which follows your hesitance to say anything about it in the get-go. Why do we have a hard time in nonprofits in the faith-based world talking about power? Why is that hard to do?
Probably because it sounds pretty authoritarian. What's the word? Authoritative?
Yeah, good one. Because it sounds authoritative and hierarchical, right?
Right.
The clientele that we serve is largely powerless.
Good one, Will. Or at least feel like they're powerless. And let me give you an example. I did this once. So I was teaching in grad school up at Valpo, what's called a core course for the graduate program in leadership and global team building. And we got into the subject, and I before we talked about it, I walked into the class and everybody was there, and I said, hey, I'm sort of fed up with this class. So here's the deal. Everybody's failing it. Closed up my thing and left. And the issue was, first of all, as the instructor, I had a lot of hierarchical power in the class, right? Because I said, holy cow. But in fact, within the context of the university, they had more power than I did in terms of being able to fail them in the class. There was a whole review process. In fact, the university's regulations prohibited me from doing something like that. But again, it's this question of perceived power and actual. So I tried to impress them that I actually had that power. And in fact, they perceived that, where in reality, I didn't even have the power to do that. So
could you say more about the relationship that you're pointing to really is between power and authority?
correct.
Where I see power as usually the ability to get something done, or to accomplish a goal, or to influence people. I mean, they're all kind of similar, but usually authority refers to some sort of claim to legitimacy, or the right to exercise the power. That's what you were pointing to in your.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have power without authority. Sometimes we have power with authority. Sometimes we just have authority.
Yeah.
Without any power behind it, or little power. So how are you putting those two concepts together?
See, and Rick, I think that's a great question about this whole thing. So most people in the kind of leadership theory language place would call the authority power position power. That is, your position as a pastor in a congregation, the head of a social service agency, a district or a synodical bishop, a district president, comes with certain position power, right? You have authority to do things. The other bucket, Rick, is called personal power. So that personal power, actually, that's a great lead-in for a couple of slides down the road. That personal power tends to reflect the ability of somebody that has skills and talents or agency to be able to influence processes. So it's independent of that position power. Rick, do you kind of see where we're going, the difference between those two?
Yeah, I just want to keep hearing how they're interplaying.
Oh, they interplay all the time. All the time. Go ahead, Dean.
I remember as a young pastor having to learn that those who held authority positions in the church were not necessarily the ones who held the power in the church. That there were influencers that had earned the right over 40 years of being leaders, even though they were done holding positions of authority. And I learned by mistake, by ignoring them in one of my first churches, and paying too much attention to those who held the positions.
And Dean and Rick, I absolutely agree. And I think nonprofits tend to be, and let me give you another example, Rick. In a military, power is very clear. I mean, you wear on your shoulder your rank, and actually most commanders have some type of emblem that lets people know that they're a commander. So there's, within the Uniform Code of Military Justice, there's very specific things that allow a commander to do and not to do. But what you'll see sometimes inside an organization, even with that strict authority, hierarchical position power, that people arise based on specific skills and talents and things in those units. And I think the same thing happens in congregations. You may see in nonprofits, you may see an authority hierarchical structure that does grant some people power, but in fact, what really happens inside, there is another entire power structure there that is based on personal, and we'll actually talk about 4 examples of that coming down the road. Great point.
What were the two denominations, or the Lutheran denomination that came together to form the ELCA? What was it?
ALC and the LCA.
And
and Mark, also the AELC.
Yeah.
Right.
Didn't at least 2 of those have very different structures in their churches? Because I didn't realize is what I noticed is in churches that came out of, or churches or pastors that came out of one of those, I see where the pastor is always the president of the council.
Huh.
And other ones, like in my case, I'm not the president of the council. And the ones who are, when I talk to them, it's more about power. There's always this sense that I need the power and authority kind of, and they don't say it like this, but I'm the head of the council, I'm the head of the congregation, so I have that position. And it's very strange because where I'm at, I'm not the president of the council, I'm a member of council. So I don't know, I'm not sure if that was distinct to the two different denominations, but I do see it more with some of the older pastors. They'll even change the constitution to become a president of their congregation.
I think the LCA had a higher status for clergy, and that's the one I'm talking about, where the LCA background supported the pastor chairing the council. There was a lower view of clergy in the ALC than in the LCA.
Yeah, that's true. And the reason was, Tom, I think this fits into what you're trying to say, is especially the Norwegians who were in the Midwest, more ALC, had seen such abuse of clergy and ecclesiastical and political power in Norway that when they came here and established structures, they did not want a strong, a powerful clergy. Your influence was the word. It was in the pulpit. But it was not in the political power structures of the congregation, where LCA felt very differently about that.
Yeah. And we see power struggles now inside the LCMS like crazy. So this is great.
Why is that though? Because you're congregational, right?
Right. Yeah. Here's a great quote.
You see it most often in pastors who appeal to their position, their office as pastor, not realizing that people won't follow just because they have the authority of pastor. You have to kind of earn that right to lead.
Yeah. This is a quote from a fellow by the name of Caro that I absolutely love this. You know, one of the standard things is power always corrupts. His point is not necessarily, but it always reveals. And I think what it reveals is what is important to somebody. So again, you'll get copies of this. Here's a definition. This is a textbook definition. And it goes along with what a number of you said, the potential or ability to influence decisions and control resources. And Rick, I think this gets a little bit more towards that authority hierarchical definition. And it's one of the three forces of leadership. So Rick, to this, here's standard academic definitions of position power. And you can see these here, but we talked about some of those already. Some of them are legitimate. I mean, you have responsibilities in a position, in a hierarchy, a position of authority. And, but what I really like to talk about are these ones, these questions about personal power. And Rick, this gets to this, and I think a couple other folks mentioned about the rise of power centers outside the hierarchy. And certainly, is there anybody that's an IT person? I don't want to offend IT people, but I've been in organizations where IT people have more power than anybody inside the organization. And because it deals with this expert side, they know how to fix things. And I think in some ways, some of the more dangerous ones are this question about referent and prestige power. The charismatic folks, the Jim Joneses, you know, the people that manage to influence people to the end that they do illegal or immoral things. So just take a look at these. These, again, get back to that question of types of power and the position, hierarchical or personal power questions. Here is a great book. If you are ever interested in reading more about power, this is Green's book, and I'll have this in the bibliography for you, about 48 laws of power. And he goes through a history within this book of these 48 laws back from the Middle Ages forward. And I just picked out some of my favorites just to get a chuckle. And actually, in a group of presidents one, Dean, you'll love this. I Xeroxed the introduction page where all the laws were listed, and we would just check the ones that people were using against us in various places. So I'm not arguing that you do these. What I'm arguing is that you understand these, because they will both be used for and against you. And I know this for us in nonprofits are hard, but these are big deals. And I especially like 29 playing all the way to the end. That's one that that's kind of interesting. 4 and 5. Yeah. This one's pretty clever. Always say less than necessary. That can make you think. And so I encourage you to think about this when you think about power. And I gave this book to a friend up at Valpo once, and they came back to me and they said, Tom, I didn't realize you were such a cynic and things like that. But it's important that you understand these as leaders with inside organizations. Okay, so given that, back to the
Tom, can you go back?
Sure. I think. Whoop, there you go.
Why don't you say a word about keep your hands clean?
Yeah, that goes. Somebody once told me about this, and this was a senior officer in the military, and he had his famous 3 I's. He said, first of all, you need to stay away from anything that's illegal. I went, okay, I got that one. Second, you need to stay away from anything that's immoral. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm saying I can understand that. And the 3rd I, he said, was stay away from things that are impractical, otherwise known as stupid. And I think what he's getting at there is that there are times and situations you need to walk away from. And I think we've seen this in some of our political systems. There are times when you need to walk away. And whatever framework you use to understand when to walk away is really important. And a short story, I used to help teach a course when I was at Concordia Ann Arbor over in the Air Force ROTC department for young officers. And one of the questions we always asked them was, how do you understand when it's time to walk away, to keep your hands clean? And these are 19, 20, 21-year-olds, everyone said, oh, I can figure that out. I'll know when to walk away. Then my next question back to them is, well, why do you think we have so many rules and regulations and laws? If it was that easy, everybody should be able to figure it out. And the point is, as human beings, as sinful ones, God gave the law to the Israelites as a box to say, don't go outside this box, because you're hurting yourself, you're hurting others, and you're hurting me. So, Rick, I've always looked at it in that question of keeping my hands clean is, when do I decide to walk away?
Could you say more about that as far as leadership? Because I think what often impresses leaders at whatever organization is one says, well, you got to jump in and get your hands dirty. And now they're not talking about the 3 I's,
right? But
they are talking about when you're involved in hiring and firing, when you're involved in major strategic moves where people's lives are affected, you can't keep your hands clean in some sense. Maybe you can with the 3 I's, but in another sense, people get upset because your decisions did not roll their way, and curricula gets changed, faculties get changed, people move in and out, aren't always happy, and would accuse the leader of moral failing, even, not just bad decision making. So often that takes us back because we're trying to keep with the 3 I's, and we're trying to keep our hands clean. And I'm not sure life always allows us to keep our hands clean. I guess that's my point. I'm wondering how you would frame that.
Yeah, and here's Rick, I think this is a perfect example of a paradox. I mean, it is something where Yes, and I would say getting your hands dirty means being engaged in the work of the place.
Mhm.
You cannot step away from it.
Mhm.
But you also need to be able to understand when the 3 I's get to be an issue. And I think, Rick, what's really interesting about this question is sometimes it becomes such a whirlwind in places you can get sucked down into the 3 I's and not initially even know it. And to me, the test is, how do you know when it's time to leave? So let me give you a parallel one, Rick. We had to, in the military, obviously it was really important to be engaged in the life of your unit. You had to be. And there was this position hierarchical power within it. But when I was in senior service school, one of the specific courses we had to take was, when do you disobey an order? When is an order unlawful? And so it wasn't saying that you shouldn't get your hands dirty, but that's where this keep your hands clean is. Oops, I'm sorry. The question is, when do you end up in that position where it's an unlawful order? And so maybe the metaphor here is, and I guess that's where I'm going to kind of close my comments on this, Rick, and let you come back. The metaphor here, to me, is being used sort of in 2 different contexts a little bit.
Mhm.
Agree or disagree? You see, and so certainly getting your hand dirty and engaging within the institution in the congregation is critically important. And a leader cannot walk away from issues.
See, that would, I don't want to dominate here, but I'll just say, sometimes when you're a pastor, I think our instincts are to keep our hands clean. That's just how.
Oh, okay.
And often, anytime you wield power at whatever level, you'll probably have to get your hands dirty.
Yep.
That's the way power functions and authority. And therefore, many pastors and maybe agency people as well, I'd have to hear more, it brings you to inactivity because you're afraid to act, because you sense every act going to the left or the right is going to create pain, hurt, maybe even injustice. And you see that, and then under the rubric, keep my hands clean, I do nothing because I'm afraid to act.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. But what's interesting in that is that we combine getting your hands dirty with using power. It's another one of those metaphors that takes power in a negative place, where in fact power can be neutral. It's how you use it is where it goes in a positive and negative place. But I agree with you. This and I don't have time to go into it. He devotes 20 pages to each one of these. And I think you're absolutely correct that within a congregation, a pastor can't just walk away from conflict.
So, Tom, can I just add a little thing here? This is a great conversation, because when you put this together with complexity, this is what we all struggle with. This creative sense of leadership rather than the reactive leadership, which is being there to solve the problems as they arise. Creative leadership, is coming from that inside out place. And, our landscapes are always disruptive. I can imagine in a congregation, social service agency, higher ed, they're all disruptive. They're very complex organizations with a lot of things acting, and sometimes we don't know the consequences of all the things at play. And Jennifer Berger Garvey is one of the really great people out there doing research on complexity and power. And maybe this gets at it partly, Rick. One of the things she's said lately is that you need to accept and embrace the idea that you can't, as leaders, that we have to accept and embrace the idea that you can't predict and control outcomes. And that it's more about identifying the direction instead of the destination, and being present to what is, which is, that kind of you know, strong back, soft front, wild heart. Brene Brown talks about braving the wilderness. I think this is the part where Daryl talks about this unfurling. You really have to know your core. As leader or pastor or CEO or president, you have to know where you are, you know, where you are. And then this idea that, you know, can we experiment with this and learn with this? Can we keep the communication chapters open as we work this through with a group of people? I don't know if that adds any color to this conversation or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think this is the type of stuff we need to be talking about as we go down our own individual leadership paths, because I'm sure everybody's seen Power, and that actually gets into the next question, and I'll put these two up here at the same time, is understanding and seeing power used within your organization. So I'm going to ask a quick one here. When, where, and what type of power have you used? Give me some examples. You personally. I'll give you one. Okay. Not that I take command of a squadron. Probably one of the premier assignments in the United States Air Force. F-16, you know, up here. And the first thing I had to do, and this gets a little bit to what you're getting at, Rick, is bring a pilot into my office and say, either you're not going to fly F-16s or I'm going to take away your wings, because you're going to kill yourself or you're going to kill somebody else. Because the previous commander didn't take care of that issue. You know, that's power. Give me a couple examples.
Well, I think about teaching when I was teaching at the seminary, that I had the power to shape the way the pastors talked about their preaching. So the power over the language. I could influence the language they used to talk about the preaching task.
Great point.
I think when we talk a bit about just staff roles and what that, and we talk through organizational change and what that makes sense from where the staff sit and what their roles might look like in that ever-changing landscape. So we have a bit of that shaping and directing of what ultimately their set of responsibilities and contributions to the organization look like.
Great. So framing language, Dean's example, framing responsibilities inside an organization, or all exercises in power. Anybody want to throw in the last one? Go ahead.
Tom, Mark is on the chat. He's in a coffee shop, you know, and he said, and if everybody can see the chat, this is a good way if you don't feel like jumping in. But he said I would lean heavily on influence.
Mark, we're going to talk about influence in like 3 slides. So and jump in. So, well, again, recognizing this and seeing it, and again, looking at some of the things like that book on Power 48 Laws can really help you understand what's going on inside an organization. So why do organizational politics happen? Dumb question. It happens everywhere. We're human beings. Hey, yes.
Is it because those who feel powerless want to assume power?
I think that's part. I think those are some really interesting points. Yep.
I mean, I often wonder if some of the most powerless people in our congregations outside the church find a way to embrace power within the church.
Yeah. Nice one. Any others? Here's a hip pocket way to think about organizational politics. First of all, they happen everywhere. There is no place that doesn't have organizational politics. And this model comes out of the Harvard Business Review. But the two axes here, so the x-axis, source of power, informal and formal, and then where the activity takes place, whether it's in an individual or organizational level. And they use these four metaphors to talk about it. But in the weeds model, you walk into someplace and you see this, what you're going to see is lots of informal, personal power, and it's going to be at the individual level. And guess what, Mark? Influence, right? This is influence at a personal level. The rocks is really interesting, is that there is a formal hierarchical set of power, and it's really at the individual. And by the way, they don't argue that any one of these is any better than another, but it's simply a description. And then the high ground is kind of interesting. Very formal, very much at the organizational level. So it's a classic bureaucracy. Formal authority, organizational systems, all those things make that a bureaucracy. It's like when you have to fill out your travel voucher and get money. What I find fascinating about the woods is the metaphor here about the trees and seeing what's happening. It's really that and it's a lot about culture. I mean, all these have to do with culture, but implicit norms, hidden assumptions, and unspoken routines rule. Well, we don't do things that way here. We always do them this way. Or here's what the elders do. And there were hidden routines in the church where I grew up that I knew as a kid, if I broke any of those, I was in deep doo-doo, really. It was very straightforward. There wasn't a written list, but man, I knew if I got outside that box, I was in big trouble. So use this as just a way to think about where you are and what that might look like. Mark, you gotta like John Maxwell's definition. Leadership is influence, and then Cashman, authentic influence. So Mark, let's talk about influence tactics, because that is more on the personal power way. How do we influence people? And I think I've got 9 generic influence tactics here, and I'm not going to go through all these. But I'm Mr. Logic, since I'm a science guy. Clearly, I just showed you a chart, and you can understand that that's the way we have to do things. I mean, come on, get on board. Personal appeals is what I love, and I'll use an example of Penny's dad. This exchange, Penny's dad was a great human being, but he lived in a world of influence and exchange. And it was, if I do something for you, I expect you to do something for me. Or vice versa, if somebody does something for me, I'm going to do something for them. But it is an incredible influence tactic when you think about it. Just like the 48 laws of power, you need to understand these. Mark, you want to throw anything in on those?
When I'm just cutting and pasting, I was actually looking at that article. I actually found it. I wanted to get some definitions for the woods, the weeds, and all that.
Oh, okay. I'll send you all this stuff along the way so you can look all that up.
Appreciate that.
In the bibliography.
When I look at the 9 generic influence tactics, I mean, go back one. Can you go back one? Probably the top 2, or no, probably consultation, getting others to participate in planning, making decisions, and changes. That's probably how I leverage my influence. The top 2 also probably more in a sermon, the rational persuasion, inspirational appeals. But I think my influence is getting people together to come up with a decision, and sometimes guiding that, sometimes just waiting to see what happens. But I probably lean more on the consultation side.
Okay, and I'm actually going to go on to this next one. So what influence tactics do you use most often? Mark, you already answered yours. Anybody else want to throw in? And I'll go back to these. And don't forget.
I use narrative or story, probably more on the inspirational appeal.
Yeah.
the use of story to persuade is pretty big in my leadership toolbox.
Anybody else want to throw any in? Obviously, I worked at one place where it was all about this. But what we didn't understand is, and this is to your point, Dean, was really we needed to be doing inspirational and consulting as much as rational persuasion.
I know I don't use ingratiation.
Nice one. Well, and you know, this pressure and legitimizing tactics, I had worked with a boss. It was an amazing guy one time, and we did a very complicated analysis. And I took all the equations out of the slides to go talk to the Air Force Council. And he reviewed it. He said, "Tom, where are the equations?" And I said, "Sir, I put them in the backup. Nobody will understand." He said, "Put them back in the slides. That's the point. Nobody will be able to understand them. It'll be down here under, you just legitimated what we're doing because you understand it and they don't." So I'm not arguing that as an influence tactic, but it's kind of fascinating. I think what's important is to know what you use and what tactics have been used to influence you. There's both sides of this equation, because all this builds to the question of decisions. Culture, power, influence tactics, all those things build to this question of decisions inside your organization. So this, I love this. Sally Jenkins wrote this, 8 years ago, and she talked about this research done on the things that drive followers nuts. And notice what I highlighted. What they want are these things, including decision making. What they don't want is indecisiveness. And what Hogan says here, and that she quoted, was that the teams are lost because followers withdraw their consent to lead, period. I don't care if that's in a congregation, a social services agency. I've seen that happen in the military, even when there was a hierarchy of law that said that person should be the leader, but people just lost it. So here are some, and I'll give you more references on questions on making decisions, but I want to get done in time so that we can look at one particular model of decision making that I would advocate. So these decision traps, just keep this list of 6 things here. And again, I'll send you these slides because they're classic ways we end up rationalizing what we and how we made a decision. This framing one is especially important. Dan Ariely, and he is kind of a decision academic, talks about an example when folks were given a choice when they got their driver's licenses about whether they would donate their organs or not. And the way it was originally framed, the question was originally framed, they had to agree to do it. And there was a bunch of data, and the number of people agreeing were really, really low. What happened was they changed the license application to say you had to agree not to donate your organs. That is, you had to check the box to say, no, I don't want to do that. And the amount of people willing to donate organs tripled over that time. And the point of that example is how you frame a decision is almost as important as any data you put behind it. So I really, you'll see this in my bibliography for you, and I ask that you take a look at it. So individual and group decision is a means to an end. There's all kinds of things here. I can't go through all these today. What I'm going to do is one model that I think you will find useful in where you live. And I don't expect you every day to have a copy of the Vrun Yet and Yago decision model in your drawer. and then you pull it out when you have to make a decision. But the questions you ask in this decision process are really important. So, and here they are. So technical quality, team commitment. Do you as a leader have sufficient information to make it? Is the problem well structured? If you make the decision, will your team commit? Do the team members share goals? Conflict over preferred solutions likely? And does your team have enough information to make a quality decision? And the types, and they really go into some more, but they really talk about these 5 decision styles, from you solve it to you share the problem with the team and you generate it by consensus. So Mark, that's one end of the spectrum where you talk about consensus, and the other side, you make the decision yourself. So, and do not run away when I give you this drawing, but it's, and I'm going to get my little thing up here, my annotate, but it begins down here with understanding the problem. Okay, so go back to the questions, and the first is, how important is technical quality of the decision? So let's pick something. Mark, what's a decision coming up for your congregation that's like, what kind of pencils you buy or paper or whatever?
The decision's kind of already been made, but let's pretend it's not.
Okay.
One of the decisions coming up is, will we go to a text to give model or not for the 20 and 30 somethings who no longer carry cash or checks?
Okay, so an online giving model or a, checks or standard offering.
Right.
Okay, so let's think about that. How important is the technical quality of this decision? Mark, when you think about this, is it high or low?
When you say technical quality, I'm a little gray on that. I didn't quite get that. When you say technical quality.
Well, in fact, to implement the decision, is that going to be hard, or is that relatively easy? Can you buy software someplace that makes that easy?
Yeah. From a technically implementing it, provided the finance people buy off on it and they know what fund is being donated to, and they can track that for people's giving, it's actually a pretty easy solution.
Okay, so we're going to go down to this one then. We're going to say it's low. Now, here's a really important question. How important is it for your team, your staff, and your congregation to be on board with that commitment?
It has to be, well, let me think about it. Probably, it depends.
Okay.
Tech really, if they're not on board with it or not, it doesn't matter because they don't have to use it. But there are people who have opinions, and even though they're not even in the target audience, they have opinions on why we should or should not do it.
Okay.
So I could say whether they choose to accept it or not, it really doesn't matter. I'll still go with low.
Okay, well that says using Vroom, Yet, Yago, and I'm not drawing a very good line. You ought to just go ahead and make the decision.
We did, touchdown. We'll pay hell for it in a couple of weeks.
But you can see, for example, when we moved our campus, the technical quality of that decision was very high. We went up here. And did I have enough decision information to make the decision? I needed a lot. So, and I needed huge team commitment.
Right.
So it was up there. The technical quality behind that, let's see, make sure I've got it. Do I have sufficient? I did not have sufficient information to make that all by myself. I had a lot of it. So we followed through here, and where we ended up was here, in consultant 2. And in consultant 2, what that means is we share the problem with the team as a group, get all kinds of decisions and stuff, but the final decision was made not by a vote, it was made by the board, which actually had to vote on it. But it was not a group consensus. And there were people within inside our organization that were not happy. But we also got to a point where we couldn't vote on it. My argument about this is, let me go back. Oops. I don't know if I can do that. It's not.
So what do you do? What do you do in the case here? So going all the way back to the QR, where you say how important is the technical quality of the decision? That seems to be a very important part, because
Exactly.
I may think it's low, they may think it's high.
Exactly.
And so I go down the low path and find out I completely sabotage myself because I didn't realize their perception that it was more difficult than it is. And I have some older people on the team. Well, one person who's like, well, we got to know how to do this. We got to communicate it to the congregation. Everybody has to know about this. And we have to provide all this documentation. And I said, well, I send it to my kids. Hey, if you want to give Texas this number. And they said, yeah, that makes sense. So they're like, yeah, I'm good. So, I mean, part of it is the perception. If it's, not the facts, but the perception if it's high or low.
Yeah, I agree. And in that case, Mark, I take two paths and see where I end up. Okay, when you get in those types of places, I think I would look at that.
Yes.
Where I want to leave you with in this is these questions, and I'm sorry I can't get my little screen doodads here off. Maybe I can erase that. Well, but just for you to think about, in fact, I'm going to put this back on. Just for you to think about these questions as you make decisions is a really, really important thing. So let me just show you some documents and then we'll, so I will email everybody a copy of this and I'm going to go share this now, I hope. I'm going to stop this share and share this. Let me just close this. Okay. So I'll send this out, which is a bibliography on decision-making power, the GLOBE studies. Here's the references for that. I will also send out this document, which can be a tool, and for y'all, the Varun Netanyahu model is a great model, but this will also talk to you about some things for group decision-making that you may find useful. This is an article out of the Harvard Business Review last year on a personal way to think about how to make your decisions better. And the fourth document will be, and this is a current hot topic, how does artificial intelligence make and help us make decisions, and will the nature of leadership change? So I'm going to go ahead, stop share. You'll get those materials as soon as we're done here. And that was a huge amount that we covered, but the links from culture and complex systems to power, understanding that influence tactics, down to decisions are critically important for you to understand in your leadership. And I know you know this is only a top level view over all that. So how about questions? Or it's too much to even absorb for questions. We've already lost some folks, I know. We're a little bit over time, but that's okay.
I do think giving some examples of culture and how it interrelates with power and authority would be fascinating, because I think we've all been in various organizations and like a faculty and a congregation or a university staff or working in a hospital are all very different cultures in how expectations on how decisions will be made.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. I mean, a lot of churches, they're happy that decisions are not made as long as the process is right, you know? Yeah. So, and other organizations couldn't function unless decisions were made, and they don't mind. Some staffs don't mind if wrong decisions are made. They just want to, they have a bias toward activity and movement rather than always getting things right. So again, the culture of a place is fascinating when it comes to the topic you're lifting up.
Yeah, and Rick, that actually goes back to the GLOBE studies, these 9 dimensions here, and how they inside an organization. And of course, the GLOBE studies are not just types of organizations, but also cross-cultural. I agree. Okay. we can take a look at that. And certainly you know that from the academic world, right? Where the expectations are down here in group collectivism. I mean, everybody expects to be involved in every decision.
Yes, and it's very different, you know, like
Yep.
doctors in a hospital have a different expectation of their role in decision making versus some staffs where really the bias is you get together, you make a decision, and then you accept the collective decision. You don't, yeah. So congregations are fascinating because I don't know if they're either fish or fowl.
Yeah.
I mean, but one thing that's helpful with this that I didn't realize, and I'm a systems guy, and so like, you know, the decision chart and all that's great, but whether you use their model or another model, it would be advantageous to know, even if it's your model, what decision-making process you follow.
Right.
Especially if you're like in an environment where there have been good decisions made, it wouldn't be the worst idea to capture your own individual decision model and almost take 10 minutes and dream, what does this really look like, and see if you can model it in the future to see if there's...
And I think also that's a great point. I think, and it goes to Rick too, people as a leader, people need to understand how you make decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why? Because that's part of trust.
Well, I probably said this, we have a real simple decision-making model. We read a book called The Decision Maker, which was just crazy transformative. It was, the way I tell it is, I am not the decision maker, but I get to make two decisions. Who makes decisions and how decisions are made. And then we read through the book, and it's basically, if you want to make a decision, first of all, you have to go, you have to go down. People that are, I don't want to say beneath you, but like if you're a supervisor, you have to ask the people below you. You have to ask the people next to you, like your peers. You have to go up and ask the people you report to. And then at the end of that, after you do this decision maker process, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, we get behind the decision.
Yeah.
Because so a lot of what in our culture, what people ask is, who's the decision maker on this? Or I'll say, you're the decision maker on this. You get to make the decision. And what I've seen is it's very empowering because they know, I tell them, I would rather have you make a bad decision using the process, to your point, Rick, than making a good decision without the process. Because I think it's important that they fall and realize, I think my boss has my back because he's going to stand beside the decision I make if I make that decision. I was in an environment where you make a decision, and if it wasn't the right decision, then you'd have to, your boss would, you'd have to repent, or you'd have to change the decision to make his decision. So they would let you make decisions as long as they were okay. But I never felt empowered, like I could make decisions. Like on the little things, go ahead and make decisions. On the big things, no, you're not allowed. So yeah, for us, it's simple. Who's the decision maker? And then, it's not about authority, because some people say, well, do I have the authority? It's like, it's not about authority. You get the right to make the decision. And then you have to stand behind you if you do the process well.
Two interesting points on that, Mark. During a large project or something, the decision-making model may change over the scope of that project.
Right.
When we moved to campus, we were involving people in decisions to move and things like that, and how we're going to do this. When we got down to painting the rooms, no, everybody didn't get a vote on. We bought a bazillion gallons of beige paint.
Right.
Everybody, so that may change over time, and helping people understand that, I think, is really important.
We also, if somebody my worship director, she can make the decisions on worship. However, if she wants to give that right to somebody else because they're closer to the problem, she can actually give that other person the right to make the decision. So they're not only empowered to make decisions, but they can let somebody else make the decision if they choose.
And what's interesting about this also, and this is a congregational example, we were part of a mission church and would move back and forth. It was in Northern Virginia area, and we were gone during the church building process. And during the building process, the type of chairs that were bought for the congregation for this, which was a joint use area, almost split the congregation in half. It was an incredible issue, right? So we moved back, and I'm now an elder trustee. I don't remember where it was. And somebody said, and the president, hey, Tom, we need to go buy more chairs. And I went, you gotta be kidding me. I know exactly what happened the last time we tried to buy chairs. And so I said, does everybody get to vote? And as it turns out, it was a non-issue. I could have bought any kind of chair I wanted. The issue was not the chairs. The issue was the process going behind all that in the building and how decisions were being made in the building. And the chairs ended up being the place where everybody decided to fall on their sword. Yeah, fascinating. So, hey, we are 10 minutes over on our time. This is a great topic, clearly one that engages people. And this, again, was only a top-level view at some of these questions. I'll talk to Lauren, and when I send this out, we may want to address some more of these questions when we get to the mid-year retreat. But any other comments for the good of the order? And we'll go ahead call it quits.
Thank you
very much. You all take care.
Thank you.
You betcha.
Bye, everyone.